We're live. Welcome everyone from me as well. My name is Maria Bengtsson. I'm a partner at EY. I lead the mobility sector for EY. So I'm a consultant now. I did a while back work for General Motors Europe, which everyone knows is no longer a thing. So you can imagine how long ago that was. But at the time I was working in commercial finance. We had some kind of false starts in terms of EVs at the time, but again, it's a while ago, and it was very much focused on diesel and petrol at the time. As a consultant, I've been covering electric vehicles and the electrification since 2017. And I also have an energy background, so I'm really keen to have discussions like this where we really kind of put together all of the different parts of the EV ecosystem, to use a consulting term, that need to come together. So really looking forward to the discussion today. I've got an agenda with some detailed points on that I will try to stick to. However, if I give the word to someone else wants to come in, just raise a hand. I'll make sure that you get to make your point as well. I think given that we're filming, I haven't checked this with Neil and Jamie and Matt, but I do hope that we're okay. If someone does feel like they want to cut something out eventually, I mean, because we want to have a good discussion, don't feel like, oh, we're filming this, so I need to kind of be on my toes all the time. It's much better if we can have a discussion and then really open with each other and go, actually, you know what, that piece there, I don't want to include formally. At least personally, I feel like if I have to think about all the time what I'm meant to say and not say, it just hampers the discussion. So if that's okay with everyone, I think we'll go with that. Okay, so the first session of the day is meant to be focusing on what is the current situation and how is electrification, how do we see electrification at the moment? And then later on in the day, we'll think more about, well, where do we need to get next and what's the kind of end game here? But for now, we're just going to focus on what's the factual sort of situation now? Do we have enough understanding of what's needed for electrification? Do we need more data? Do we need more vehicles? Do we need more grid? I'm assuming we're going to say yes to all of that, but let's get into the meat of the discussion. So what I thought was we're going to start with Lorna and Dave to give their perspectives from a fleet perspective, and then I'm going to open up for other people to come in and comment on the current status. Just to give you an idea of where we think we're heading with this, is around data. How do you plan routes? Do you have enough information to understand what an electric vehicle might need differently? What about real-time data, performance visibility, cost, big issue obviously, and then we're going to move over to infrastructure and a little bit more about system integration. But if we kick off with you guys, Lorna, are you happy to go first?
Fine. Warn me next time I'm going to go first, Neil. So Lorna McAteer, currently head of fleet at National Grid, and very recently, July the 1st, picked up the procurement responsibility for all the fleet over in the US where we operate as well, so mainly East Coast side. So in total, there's about 20,000 units, ranging from everything from really, really small, lots of company cars in the UK, which nearly all are electric, all the way up to the heavy trucks, the very specialist bits of kit, including trenchers and all sorts of other really random bits, and a few helicopters. So my journey through transition has been quite varied. So started my journey in fleet back at E.ON. So the only reason I know anything about energy is because I worked for two power companies in my career. I'm now at National Grid, so I've had to learn very fast both sides of the fence, because when I hit a stage, everybody asked me grid connections. So I've had to learn things on that. But it's been an interesting transition through, and I think one of the things we need to bear in mind on this is the experiences we have. It's not always easy. And you actually really need people who are passionate about what they're doing in order to make a change. And one of the things I'm often saying to people, in the experience I've had in all three companies, I was at Royal Mail before this, unless there is someone in finance willing to sign it off for you, you are going to have a battle every single step of the way. And there are only two reasons fleets generally change. One is legislation and one is cost. And if those two aren't working together, then you're not going to get anywhere. And that is exactly the experience we've had. And it's pushing that forward. So I think the activities we need from this are how do we help with that cost for those fleets that can't, versus how we overcome the legislation side of it. So until somebody's told they can't do something, they're going to keep doing it. Best intentions in the world, and that's what we found. Even some of my drivers, I've got the advocates that wanted to go, then I had those that scared the life out of me because they'd got a pacemaker and they said they don't want to go near a rapid charger. It took me 2 years, by the way, to get somebody to tell us that yes, there is a kite mark on rapid chargers and they are perfectly safe. But if as an industry we can't give that comfort factor to drivers, none of us want to be that first fleet that's going to have a problem. Do you want any more?
Actually, I was going to ask you one thing you mentioned there in terms of understanding the electrification process. So I wonder from your point of view, how much did you spend understanding the requirements of your current fleet when it was diesel or petrol, and what changes you may need to make, and how do you balance that between doing that and doing it really thoroughly, which can take a really long time, and you'll have data inefficiencies or deficiencies, etc. How do you balance that with sort of learning as you go, so to speak? How much data did you feel like there was an issue there?
Masses of data. So I was a whirlwind when I hit National Grid because they'd only just started looking and discussing whether they were going to buy a few vehicles. And I kind of came in pre-COVID, but I spent 3 months proving with data what I already knew instinctively, that cars were a no-brainer. At that point in time, with the grants available, with everything else, so I literally mapped out every single car on fleet over the lifetime of its fleet, which is why it took me a very long time. My spreadsheet was like this. There were calculations in it all over the place. Presented it to the board, got it through the finance director, and as a result, they signed off a 10-year strategy for me without blinking, because they could suddenly see, actually, this makes sense. It was all about that return on investment. And that's why the only reason I made it successful, I already knew. I knew more than some of the others. There was embarrassingly a team, we are being recorded as well, aren't we? There was embarrassingly a team that were trying to put in Type 2 chargers, and we were buying Nissans, which are Type 1. And it's like, it's not going to work. So you need to rethink what we're doing out there. So there was a lot of experience that I had to bring. And again, one of the things I kept saying to people, let's do one, because then you gain some experience and you learn lessons you didn't even realise you were going to learn. So it was a lot of personal effort to get people to move. But once I'd got a few people on board, it worked. And then once I'd got it into the execs bonus, it worked even faster.
Okay, thank you. Shall we move to you, Dave? Just you obviously got a different perspective on fleet and electrification. So, just cover sort of similar themes, I guess, just to kind of kick us off.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, obviously coming from a completely different end of the spectrum to Lorna, Voltloader is a relatively new business. So I founded the business about 2.5 years ago. That was following a career advising large energy companies and more latterly commodity supply chain companies through various transformation challenges over the last 20-25 years, and recognised that there was a challenge and opportunity in terms of the electrification, decarbonisation of road freight. So I turned my head to that challenge, and Voltloader was really set up to catalyse that transition, or to help catalyse that transition. In terms of starting that process, I think I knew from the early days that to do that I would have to tackle both, what's become known as the chicken and the egg. So the charging side of things, and also to put trucks out on the road, and to make those things work in unison to get uptake. I also recognised that to make it properly function, those two parts of the business would need to be commercially viable. So I couldn't be subsidising one part of the business with another part of the business. They both had to stack up in their own right. And so that was really the the premise in terms of how the business was built. So now we run a small but growing fleet of all electric articulated vehicles, and we are building charging capability in depots predominantly, but also at our own sites of our customers. So we're helping customers transition by providing them the full package, if you like. So we're an operator, we have our own license to run the vehicles, but we're also installing that charging capability, as I am providing that full catalyst at a, you know, in a commercially viable way for our customers that can help them get off the starting blocks. That will hopefully and is doing, encouraging customers to transition their own fleets to electric vehicles, and also by having that charger network across both our customers' depots and our own sites, we're now encouraging their suppliers to start using that charging capability and commit to buying electric vehicles. So it's this whole ecosystem, and you've sort of got to start somewhere. And, you know, I think we've taken a very ground up, pragmatic approach in terms of how you roll this out, but we knew it had to be commercial. I totally agree with Lorna in that the two key things here are price and legislation, and those two things are interrelated, as I'm sure we'll talk about today. But we knew that we had to make this commercially viable to get it off the ground. So we don't have the legacy of a diesel fleet to worry about. We can start from scratch in terms of how we thought about how we build our commercial model, if you like. So that I think that has been a benefit, because I think it gives us a level of freedom. And it's not easy, again, to Lorna's point, it's not easy to do that. But I think we have managed to, I mean, our vehicles have now been on the road our first vehicles have been on the road since February of 2024. And we are showing that it is viable and it works. And it's a little bit about, to start with, how we're picking, obviously there's some limitations in the technology at the moment, and it's a little bit about how you pick those routes. And we've talked about data. I think, you know, we've seen no end of, you know, sensible, you know, viable routes that these vehicles can use. So that's not an excuse. Most businesses have routes that these vehicles can use. I'm not saying they could transition their entire fleet, but most businesses will have use cases where they can put these vehicles into operation. I think it's about breaking down some of the educational challenges in terms of, you know, there's such a big gap between a diesel operation and an electric operation, and it's about how you break down the education, the terminology in terms of how you get people to sort of feel more easy about doing that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you both. I think there's 2 points there that I'd like to pick up on. So starting with data, you all mentioned data and the accessibility, etc. And a lot of times when I speak to companies, you know, you'll have some companies who really are interested and are doing all of this themselves, like U2 and Welsh Group as well, of course. But I also speak to a lot of companies who say, you know, we've just done a couple of cars, for example, and we got some charger out in the back of our office building, but everything else is too hard. So I want to open it up to the room and ask, where do you think we are in terms of the data? Is the data available, but people don't really know how to use it? Could the data be available, but someone needs to make it available to the fleet operators? Or 3, I suppose, is there actually something that's missing? And so actually there is something we all need to work on together just to make that electrification easier for those who maybe aren't so inclined to go and do their own research. Does anyone want to kick us off?
When you say the data, like what specifically are you?
I'm specifically thinking about the data that would enable someone to get more comfortable around electrifying, whether it's a whole fleet or part of the fleet. Is that, I guess at the heart of this for me is data a useful excuse sometimes, do we think? Is it actually there, or are there areas where we don't know enough, or the operators don't know enough, but there are ways and means of getting them that information, and that might speed up electrification? I think that's
I think one of the things you need to remember is, depending on the size of the company, the person who's taken on the responsibility of the transition isn't always the one that has the data. So it may be the fleet operator, it might actually be the finance person, it may be the person at the top that's decided as part of their sales pitch, the company is going to be sustainable. You have got data in lots of different places. So a fleet manager is not always going to have all the property information, and therefore all the kilowatt hours and half hourly rates or any of that side of it, they won't have it. They won't have all the information about the properties that they perhaps own. So depending on where you are, your data is going to be in different pockets. So it will be there, they just won't know necessarily that it's there.
So again, just thinking of my own experience talking to people, I often say, if I go and speak to someone, if the question is up at the CFO level, that's an indication that the company is taking it seriously. If I'm speaking to, doesn't have to be electrification, it could be another issue, but if I'm speaking to the financial controller or someone in procurement, etc., I know that they haven't quite elevated the issue. So just making that analogy, are you in fact saying that the problem needs to be understood at least, sort of at C-suite, because otherwise
you need the collaboration.
Be,
if you don't have the collaboration, then it's not going to work because you're pushing water up Niagara. It's just not going to happen. And there'll be too many battles that you have to fight on the way. So you have to have someone senior enough to sponsor it for you, to help you overcome some of the barriers. Because what you've got, and the bigger the company is, the worse it gets, you've got an operational need that then fights a change. Because it's, no, this is how I do my job. I'm coming in, I'm going to do my job. I need to get to that target, whatever that is. I need to repair this. I need to deliver this. And that is their focus because they've got a finite time to do that. They're not going to be thinking about what they need to do differently. And that's where one of the challenges is. It's a mindset change. So yes, you can have the data, but unless you can articulate that data and then get it back to the right people, you're still going to have a battle.
Yeah. Any views from you there, Dave?
I mean, we often see a senior direction that wants to change, but then what we see is as it drops down the organisation, it gets lost in the daily operational challenges. And I think, one practical question I think we've got for the industry is, from a sustainability perspective, I think we see a lot of companies paying, or making a gesture towards sustainability and, having a head of sustainability or, sort of whatever that might be. But quite often we see that function is still reporting, say, into finance or marketing and being driven by those functions, whereas we need to see a level of autonomy in that sustainability agenda and a sustainability team or resource that has teeth in the organisation. I think until we start seeing that, I think we will start to, we will see misalignment across the organisation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I suppose that's predicated on the assumption that doing anything green is going to be a cost. Like, I think, as Lorna said, like, if you can do it based on being a saving, then it wouldn't need to be its own function. So I suppose you lean into the data point around the lack of visibility or potentially how you work out where you can electrify something. It's typically because realistically there's a performance issue at times with the electric alternative to diesel. So i.e. you couldn't just put an electric truck into every route and it would work tomorrow because of lack of ability to deliver the payload, the range, charging options, etc. And so you have to then do data analysis to work out where could I deploy an electric truck. And then you have to build a business case because at the moment it costs more than the diesel equivalent on a TCO basis, whether that just be because of the cost of a kilowatt hour, the cost of the truck, both things together, the cost of insurance, or a number of factors. So I suppose the problem that exists today is more around it's difficult to build business cases because of the cost premium, and therefore it's difficult to get alignment because of the cost premium. And I think typically we all believe that cost premium to be a here and now problem and probably not a 20 years ahead problem. If it is a 20 years ahead problem, I think the transition's got a challenge, full stop. Which is why, for example, I was really bullish on things like the decarbonisation of industrial gas, like the use of gas in industry, because I'm like, well, gas would probably be cheaper than electrification for quite a long time in things like making glass or cement, etc. Whereas I don't think that's true for road freight. So I suppose my point would be, I think we need to focus on that cost. Where is there a cost advantage, and build the business cases around those things, and where there's not a cost advantage, almost just park it for now in a way is my view, or unless you can get budget from somewhere else, and be really keep it acutely focused on delivering cost advantages, because I think that's a better narrative for businesses, for society, for the public. You know, like, I'm running an electric truck on this route because it saved me money is a much better story than because I care about it being green. The fact it's green is a bonus in a way. And the more people start to believe that electric vehicles or transportation is saving money for us as a society, we'll see advocacy for it full stop, I think.
But we have a problem with that. So I know I said I got a 10-year strategy signed off, and then I had a bunch of new execs come in, and their focus was very different to other people. So I had to redo the entire business case. And we see that everywhere at the moment. We see it with Trump and the politics. We've seen it with the Conservatives and Labour. What we've unfortunately got is too much short-termism, and there isn't enough consistency in either legislation or future thinking, or even in corporates and businesses. Your smaller family-run businesses will think longer term, but also don't have the flexibility to make the changes in a lot of cases. So you've got this real challenge of having to go over your business case again and again and again in order to keep proving that data. And while grants change, everything within your business case changes as well. So going back to that point, it's actually a lot harder to get that consistency even within your own organisations at times.
But surely that difficulty is defined by the policy and regulatory environment that we've got. If that was stronger, then the case becomes
Absolutely.
easier to make, and the policymakers don't have the data that they need to frame good, strong policy. And we could do worse than look at where it's been successful. So there are countries out there that are doing much better than we are at electrifying their fleets, and we should understand why. And I think the main reason is strong policy, the right sort of incentives and the right sort of penalties, and really coordinated thinking at government level. If you leave it to corporations, they'll always find a reason not to do it because they're handing over competitive advantage.
That's the commercial risk, and we've got some big operators represented in the room who are nervous about giving away their competitive advantage. And when a company takes a strategic decision, and there are one or two, Lorna, yours is one. There's a company in the construction industry, I won't name names at this point, but they have taken that decision. They want to decarbonise because they want to differentiate themselves on that basis. They want to be the leading company globally in construction in terms of their carbon footprint. They have bigger problems. They have to decarbonise making cement, which is a hell of a challenge, obviously. But one of the challenges, back to your point, Phil, is carbon doesn't have a value in our society. It's sexy. It's been pushed on the political agenda, and we've seen that in different legislative forums that we have these conversations. When we come to the commercials, it's very hard to do because saving carbon does not have any balance on the balance sheet, any value on the balance sheet, and therefore you're always, to use your phrase, pushing against an angle to try and justify something which we all instinctively know is the right thing to do, and yet the economics come back and bite us every time, and that is a huge challenge that we face. Represent the OEMs. The OEMs have a clear product development plan. The technology is all in place to do everything that we need within the commercial vehicle sector, within electric vehicle, including some of your really crazy vehicles in the States. But the economics are stacked against us because we're part of a global system that is actually really compromised in terms of doing something that is different or more expensive or more challenging, because we have such an efficient industry that has built its life around diesel and working on 2% margins for the last 50 or more years.
I'd go beyond that as well and say that the 3PL world in particular, it's not just about having that strategic direction. From our perspective, we can do that, and we have a strategic goal, certainly in terms of the 3PLs I've spoken to and our own, but it's more about the fact that we don't represent ourselves, we represent our clients. So we have to have that extra level of strategic thinking within what we do. And what we see is there's a certain willingness within the client base to move, but that wanes and grows at times. So there's still an extra level of challenge that sits there as well with our strategic directions that we want to go in. And to your point, Will, around the premiums that sit there, You know, that premium element is a massive factor, especially when you think about the short-termism, because that's the name of the game at the end of the day for the 3PL. It's getting that across the line. And I think that doesn't get enough credit in terms of what we're looking at in terms of that change.
Can I just pick up on that? Because you both mentioned the cost and the legislation, which clearly needs to be in sync. But the third piece I want to test you on is there also something about public expectations, societal expectations? Because it seems to me a lot of times, in this debate, legislation is sort of seemingly at least going one way. However, we hear about, both from a consumer sentiment perspective, where, I think the Reform Party conference, climate change, as in there is no climate change, was top 3 on the agenda, which I think is saying something. And also we hear about, companies, for example, answering to tenders where they've been told that sustainability is going to be a massive differentiator, and then they find that they lose on price. So I'm wondering whether, to add to the cost and the legislation, is there also something about the general narrative in society and people's expectations, both corporates and consumers, and how do we see that?
Well, certainly from that perception piece and the PR element that sits there with it, it's a big factor. And again, I'll come back to the point around, it's not just us that's protecting our image. It's that brand that we're representing for multiple different brands. And then how do we help them to maintain their PR image as well? So there's a perception piece there. We would represent, let's say, 250 different companies that would use our pallet network, for example. So that would be a huge number of different agendas that we're trying to go against or for. So what we tend to find is we have to put out one image, one PR perspective that we want to put across, which we're hoping is going to capture all of those within there. So it's a balancing game on that one. Yeah.
And I think if I can build on that, we at Logistics UK represent buyers and operators and infrastructure providers and supplies of support equipment into all different areas of logistics. There's as many views on this as you can imagine. I mean, from one end to the other, and actually, there's a real danger in overgeneralisation. I think there are people with passionate and ardent views on every aspect as you go forward. So establishing facts, I think, is really picking. I think, for your point, is really important, because anybody can have a view on anything, but it doesn't mean anything unless it's got facts behind it. One of the things that I hear, so I run some conferences for people who buy logistics, with people who operate and sell logistics, and generally what I hear is there is demand in the buyers for more sustainable solutions, largely driven by the fact that the buyers are of logistics operating within a manufacturing company or a retail company or a service company. Generally speaking, they're a bit on the edge of those companies, and those companies have got strategies where they want to achieve things. And so they're sitting there scratching their head saying, how are we going to do it? Yeah. And then they look at the industry and say, come on, how are we going to do this? Come on, help me. How are we going to do this? And this isn't electrification. This is decarbonisation. Yeah. So there's a real desire to look at lots of different solutions, whether it's lower carbon, not necessarily totally carbon free. Within the sellers, what they say when the buyers aren't in the room and they don't think they'll know is, yeah, but they don't want to pay for it. Yeah. And so it's not a question of societal desires will make this happen. I don't think that's true. I think it'll only happen if it's actually efficient. And it's, yes, cost of ownership, picking up your point, but actually really more importantly, cost of operation. So what happens, and that's where regulation does come in, because you start to look not just at the prices of things and the improvements in the technology, which is going on leaps and bounds, isn't it? It's wonderful, really. But you also see the regulation that says, yeah, but how much can you do with it? What's not just the range, but what's the weight? And I think it's
it's the combination of those things that our experimentation that we do, people, you know, like Chris and Jamie and their team here, providing really, really great information. And there are use cases that always work, but there's also use cases where it doesn't work at all. And so building over this kind of fear that is driven, I think, by what people know and what they don't know, and what maybe they're not really given to investigate, perhaps, I think is a really important part of this debate, because the industry doesn't make enough money to experiment. And at the moment, there's lots of experimentation going on, but there's virtually no scaling going on. And so to get from, you know, the wonderful experimentation that's being done in lots of companies all the way around the country to the point where this becomes mainstream, and we're a long way from that, I think.
Thank you. So I want to continue a bit on the cost topic, because it is obviously very crucial, as everyone said. And maybe Andrew and Niall, if you could comment from a kind of product and energy or charging perspective. I'm mainly interested in two, because we're sticking to what's the current state rather than looking ahead for now. But I'm interested in your views around, one, what is the real kind of cost landscape in a nutshell? But the second question I'm wondering is, because this is a new way of thinking in many ways, especially on the energy side, but also on the vehicles, you know, there's all kinds of new companies coming up in terms of providing services that maybe provide you with a monthly cost or something like that. So in terms of, and then also coming back a little bit to the data point, are those options, and also from a charging perspective, what the options you have, are they well understood from by people and companies? Is there something from your perspective that the OEMs or the charging companies could do better? Again, just thinking about the current situation, how would you kind of describe from an OEM and charging perspective?
From an OEM perspective, I think some of the economies of scale ultimately are determining what the price point is. And until the Chinese come into the market, I suspect we're going to be in a fairly familiar position. I think there's what is good in the last couple of years is suddenly there is competition. I was part of the Milan's launch event, and the big satisfaction for me was seeing 5 brands represented there, 5 different trucks. So finally, people have a choice. David's running different brands. He has that opportunity. He can assess the different strengths and weaknesses of different technologies. He can look at what the best fit is. Manufacturers are coming down with data. I mean, part of what we did with Renault was actually we created what we call energy transition specialists to try to change the language and inform guys who were used to just doing the same thing they always did. If you look at the waste sector in particular, very, very conservative industry, nobody should be buying a diesel refuse vehicle today. It just drives me nuts. There's a very, very simple solution, which is the financing model for that. But an electric vehicle is fit for purpose, absolutely 100%, 99% perhaps of the opportunities there. So in terms of the cost, it's brutal. The amount of change that OEMs are being asked to make with different technologies. We're still backing diesel. We have Euro 7 to deal with. We've got different types of gas. We've got CNG and LNG, which we're backing. We've still got some of the sort of niche fuels like biodiesel, for example, in some of our markets. Then you've got the whole kind of ones that is hydrogen. While we're talking about hydrogen fuel cells, or we're talking about hydrogen ice, we are, as an industry, actually a global industry, and we're having to cover all of these bases, which means that we cannot drive the cost down. We are also hugely dependent on a supply chain that begins and ends in China, I'm afraid, and they have complete control of that without being too crude about it. They have us by the neck, and the opportunities to change the economics of building electric vehicles in particular is all down to volume at the end of the day. And so that is the huge challenge there, is that we're actually not in a position to change things until the market is demanding those vehicles. It's quite a fundamental economics exercise here.
Yeah, who's done that, Andrew? Who's done that? EU did it. The EU did it in 2019, June, sent the benchmark from the manufacturers saying, you've got to save, benchmark 2019, what's your CO2 emissions? And by 2025, you've got to save 15%. You've got to do 30%, which is now 45%. And at the time, the OEM said, if you continue with this, we will see the death of at least one, if not two, European manufacturers. And we've started all this with heavy trucks in June 2019, 2020, when the manufacturers got given that CO2 emission, you have to save it. So all of a sudden, electric became the thing. So again, regulation, the unintended consequences of EU law, overlaying GB law as well, and looking at that, it all started 5-6 years ago. And the OEMs fought it, and rightly so to an extent. And then if you look at it, it's all about legislation. Do you think operators would have gone to Euro 3, Euro 4, Euro 5, Euro 6, and the manufacturers would have reduced it to Euro 4, Euro 5 and Euro 7 if legislation hadn't dictated you have to do that? Because that's the way it goes. They don't do it naturally because it adds cost to it. So when we look at it in terms of how we're moving forward, you've got to lay at the very back, you've got to go to June 2019, and the EU said 15%, 30%, and gave them these targets, and that's when we started seeing electric trucks appear. And so you've got to really understand this is an artificial created by ourselves, and then we've got to deal with it. And I think you're right.
Have the European OEMs not got an existential crisis now, though, because their pedigree was in manufacturing combustion engines and axles and things like that, which obviously then went to tier ones, but typically that is what our pedigree's been in Europe. And in an electric truck, it's 2 bits of steel for a chassis, and then it's going to be an e-axle and a battery and an electric motor, which are all going to be manufactured in China. You know, so apart from the dealership network and potentially like homologation, there's not an awful lot left for OEMs within that ecosystem, and you think if their margins are going to get squeezed because they're going to be passing more money over the fence to someone else. And then I suppose if you look at the car brands that have now entered say the UK specifically, you know, like sales of Teslas and BYDs, etc., who had no historic market share, are now doing very well because of a cost competitive vehicle. I sort of wonder whether or not European OEMs are really ever going to be able to compete in what the future will look like, and that partly why they're trying to recover costs so aggressively against the current vehicles they've had to create, and that's why the costs have been artificially high. You know, knowing that there's UK or European funding around, so you may as well charge 300k for a vehicle rather than 200k. You know, they're not taking the view of back in the day when Intel first made microchips, it sold them at a loss to get market share. No European OEMs taking that view. They're just saying we're just going to sit here in a bit of a difficult position, really.
Well, I think I agree with you, and it seems to me that the EU as well as the UK have sort of thought that, okay, we're going to put this legislation out, this policy out, which is going to force the OEMs to innovate and sort of come up with the products that are going to be required. But I think what they've forgotten is you also need the enablers and the facilitators, because as you rightly point out, you know, they've been in a all of the truck manufacturers and the car OEMs as well have been working within a certain legislation and sort of ecosystem for a very, very long time, whereas other parts of the world might have gone a different route sort of 20, 30 years ago even. We kind of kept on the same route for much, much longer, and you know, the enablers and the facilitators just aren't there now.
Well, you'd argue like for the UK it wasn't the worst thing in the world to agree, because we have very little manufacturing of any at all, you know, maybe apart from DAF assembly. But if you're Germany, I mean, it's mental, but they've done it now.
I think I said to Karen Rossum, CEO of Daimler, at the IEA show, does it worry the truck manufacturers have done everything that we requested of them? And as I said, you can do a truck now, you know, the maximum you can drive 4.5 hours at 56 miles an hour, which means the fact that it can do 240 miles. All the heavy trucks, nearly all of them, can do that. They've done their bit. And I said to Karen, does it worry you the fact that your future is in the hands, not in your hands anymore? You've done your bit. It's in the hands of legislation, regulation and infrastructure. If you don't bring these together, you're lost. And those are the key areas that we need to look at. And unfortunately, democracy is not a good thing. as we found out for these sort of things, because just like Trump and Lorna, and we see Labour and Conservative doing two different things. We go this route and then we go another route. We go this route, you go to the States. Obviously, we was in the States in April at the ACT Expo. And last year, before that, the year before that, which is Air Clean Transport, those that don't know, everything was going electric. I go there now in April, May, new legislation. Oh, it's all about gas, and it's 20% was electric. That's out now, and even California. So you look at it, whereas if you go to China, Xi Jinping, you look at this is our market, 10, 15, 20 years. We know where we're going. Everybody's together. We go like this. And, you know, and these are the things. I did a speech in India, and I said to the Indians, you're both 1.4 billion people in China, and you. I said, I go to China, I know exactly what they're doing. I come here to India, you've got great, but you're going everywhere. I said, Tim, we're a democracy. We don't even know what we're going to do next year but one. And that's the big difference that we've got. I'm not advocating we go that way, but I'm saying we need, and Phil said, we need policy and we need legislation and we need future. Because, you know, we're talking £250,000 trucks, things like this. We need to know, we need to invest. It's not a car. Our lives depend on this. So therefore we need things like future proofing. What are we doing for the next 5 or 10 years? And we can't do that.
I suppose the only thing I'd argue against requiring regulatory certainty though is none of the alternatives are going to be cheaper than diesel apart from electrification. So HVO will never be cheaper than fossil diesel. You know, LPG or CNG will not be cheaper because we would have done it originally if it was cheaper.
Well, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that.
Okay,
I mean,
okay, bio LNG or CNG won't be cheaper than diesel. So basically, the only one that can be cheaper is electrification.
Well,
so
I'm
I'd argue
no
that's the
evidence that electrification is cheaper at the moment.
I suppose, well, if electrification cannot be cheaper, then there will be no transition.
And the issue is about not just about cost of things; it's about what you can use it for, and weights.
Yeah.
Yeah, and payloads, and the very the practical things that are at the heart of this industry. And that's what frightens people. They look at a technology that's more expensive and needs fundamental change to happen to be competitive.
But anything other than diesel will be a premium on today, right?
But I talk to buyers, go back to my comment a minute ago, and I talk to buyers about what do they want. And they want a range of solutions, and electrification is definitely part of that. But actually they say, well, if I can go down a low carbon fuel route now and knock between 75 and 80% of the emissions out of what I'm responsible for, okay, it might cost me a little bit more, but actually I'll definitely do it. I talked to one very, very famous company, household name, massive brand, and it's, well, I'd do that at a stroke. Because, okay, it might cost me a few pence a litre, but over the whole spend, it's nothing compared with the impact that it's having. And so I think there are different routes to decarbonisation that does not involve electrification. Yeah, there are long-term. There's a real problem about what is the long-term solution. I think that's what's coming out in this conversation.
I don't think there is any debate on that. I really don't.
Well, when I talk to people who work in the industry, there's massive debate about it.
But if you read, so take any academically backed, credible view of a future energy system, it will always have an incredibly high penetration of electrification. There will be biofuels for non-road-based transportation, so non-road haulage, so things like aviation, potentially shipping. But there is no credible view that we can produce enough biofuels, or that hydrogen, or that, I can't think of another solution, but if there's one I'm missing. But and I have not seen anything advocated that is not electrification that's credibly backed for 2040 scenario for decarbonising.
We're talking about now, not 2040.
Indeed, but therefore.
So if that's the case, nobody will do anything until,
but I would argue, but the point
it's
is,
all there.
Every alternative now is a cost premium. So
it won't happen.
The only way
it won't happen without legislation, I think, is the point.
But I don't think I think there's a difficulty on that, isn't there? That says, we're going to push cost at the consumer.
Well, going back to the cost argument, I mean, this is probably a bit of a hand grenade in the room. So anyway, I'll chuck it in. Kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour, battery packs in China are about a third, half the price. The cost of electricity that you put into the vehicles is again about half the price. If you could translate that into the UK, then electric vehicles work. And when they work, they'll be adopted, and particularly if that adoption is reinforced with regulation. So the two questions you've got to ask is, can we get the cost of batteries down? And they have been coming down, and they're on a trajectory to come down. We need to accelerate that, and that will be research investment in production facilities and part of the industrial strategy. And the second thing is, can you get the cost of electricity down? Can you prioritise electricity into freight vehicles? And the answer to that has to be yes. And the reason it's yes is that electricity is currently priced on the most expensive contributor, which is gas. If you change that, electricity becomes much cheaper. Then you've just got the infrastructure connection charges and sorting that out. But that can be done. So all of this is doable if there's a will.
And I think that's an important point, isn't it? So that often that we confuse what we're going to do next year at individual micro company level, where I agree with you, Phil, that there's lots of choices about what you can do. But I think that there aren't lots of choices, as Will says, about what we will be doing in 2040 if we're going to get to net zero, that there's probably only one solution. And to get the benefits that Phil's talking about, to make it work, we have to have a national strategic plan of how we're going to get there. So that there's no way to reduce the cost of battery prices by sort of individually trying different things. There's no way to reduce the cost of electricity by investing in sort of hydrogen into the gas network at the same time as trying to reinforce the electricity network. So we need a direction of travel that we're trying to follow, and it can be gradated, so you can do different things each year, but we need to know where we're going so that we can all work towards doing that and get the economies of scale that we're talking about.
I think what everyone is saying, I think a little bit, is that the imperfections during the transition period is really what a lot of companies are struggling with, because whilst we think that at the end of the road we'll all be electric, or the vast majority will be electric, there will be enough charging for everyone, the right types of charging, electricity, the system will be built out in such a way that we can take all of the electricity that is required. The cost of the trucks will have come down because of, one, economies of scale, and two, innovation. But while we get there, I guess I'd be interested to hear people's views on where's that balance between individual companies have choice now to go for low carbon fuels, alternative fuels, but the OEMs, the charging companies, etc., need volumes, because you can't progress to transition unless you get more and more companies on board. So, which is a tricky.
Well, I wouldn't want to dismiss the imperfections of the current, just paint the picture that electrification is easy, because when we've been looking at this sector, we constantly get frustrated with those imperfections. So things like when you buy an electric vehicle, there's an axle load limit that you walk into straight away that affects what you can do, and you go, oh, that's easy to mitigate. Turns out it's really not easy to mitigate, and it's a real pain.
We're still waiting for the weights and dimensions. February last year, the government, and there's a Conservative government with weights and dimensions. They got Fraser Nash in there doing all the things. We were supposed to get it done in June, and guess what? Suddenly in July there was an election, and suddenly we're now waiting for weights and dimensions to be done, and we can get the 42 or 42.
And I think there was a longer trailer allowed as well, but then in practicality no one uses it because you have to fill in more paperwork to do it than you do get the benefits.
Bridge loadings, axle.
You can't even get a 4.25 tonne on a van.
Correct, exactly.
Yeah. But you need a tachograph.
Exactly.
I think there's also, and then as Phil was sort of saying, then you also look at it and go, oh, well, the battery packs in China are cheaper. But across all of the EU, they're more expensive, not by 10% or an import cost delta. It is exclusively regulatory driven, and China is not having battery fires every day. And so a lot of these concerns are purely constructed within the EU that are not really valid, let's say. So I don't think you can just dismiss all of those current problems and say, well, it's all rosy, everyone should be electric. Those things are real current blockers, and they do need to be mitigated in order to allow for electrification to be the clear path to then win out in the long term. Because otherwise, I think people keep going down the, well, do you know what, for 2p a litre, I'll go more like 10p, but I'll go down HVO, or, I'll go down, some companies that are really forward-facing have got, forward-looking have gone down the like bio-CNG route, and you sort of think, well, that's a shame, isn't it? Because all that bio-CNG could be used for something that would be better bang for your buck for decarbonisation, but at the moment, that delivers them the duty cycle, and the cost per carbon that they're willing to invest in as a business, but it's not the right solution for us as a country or as a society. It'd be better to use that bio-CNG for gas peakers to produce electricity to go into vehicles, because it would be more efficient and cheaper for everyone in the long term. But at the moment, one business can make that decision, and that's because of, I'd argue, arbitrary imperfections that are there today that could be mitigated with some sensible thinking.
Well, I think that's true, but I think there's an overriding problem, which is what you describe, which there is no roadmap. There's a piece of legislation which says be better by then, off you go, and it's not enough, and it won't work, and it will delay decarbonisation as we go through over time. There needs to be a thought through roadmap which picks up those kind of details that we've just been talking about and gives a proper sense of direction. And it needs to tie in the devolved areas as well, so we don't end up in some nonsense, really. So that there is then a sense of direction that we can work to. Because my experience before I came into this role, I worked for one of your competitors, didn't I? And we ran
Won't mention that.
We won't mention them, no. We started with a Go Green program in 2008. And by the time 10 years had gone by, they'd taken 2/3 of the carbon out of the warehousing footprint in the UK and 38% out of transport without any alternative fuel apart from a affiliate CNG up in Yorkshire. And it hadn't cost us any money, and it put in place all the measurements. So there's loads of things that you can do, but it's because the leadership was established, the measurement was established, and then you go. And I think we need to apply the same logic to what we're trying to do as a country, rather than just expecting that you throw it out there and it'll somehow happen.
So that roadmap's important, because the thing you need to develop a robust, believable roadmap is data at a national level, not at a company level, it's at a national level. Yeah. And that isn't available in this country. Other countries have done it and they've used it to great effect. It's all there. It's absolutely all there. And if we had it, we could do the modelling and we can evaluate the alternatives, and you can come up with a credible roadmap. But without it, it's very difficult.
Phil, you've been advocating for that for a while, mate, in the group.
And I've just spent a fortune getting the best data set that we can get, which covers the UK. So the data is there.
Yeah.
It's drawn from telematics companies and mobile phones and manufacturers of vehicles. But it's the first time we've been able to access it, and it's not accessible at a government level.
No.
Go on, Neil.
Can I jump in on that data point and where we're going with policy and regulation? So hello, my name's Neil. I run a small company called Power. I used to work for one of the largest electricity suppliers in the world called EDF. I based a large chunk of my career on modelling energy systems. And the problem was, and I worked both inside EDF as a private company and government in the Committee on Climate Change. The problem we always had when doing modelling is assumptions. And the reality is, when you do any modelling, you need really good assumptions. The only place to get really good assumptions is the industry. And the reality is the flow of data between industry and the actual modellers sat behind these government departments or in the consultancies is often quite poor. One of the things that fascinated me was EDF, despite changing political winds, etc., managed to move from a position of we will not build new nuclear to having government-funded and backed new nuclear. Yeah, that's a 120, 150-year aspiration. These things take ages to build. So if we're worried that there's no roadmap for getting between A and B in a sector which, by the way, I'm not from and I don't know the background to, the answer probably sits in transferring the right data to the right decision makers at the right time. And therefore, I guess one of the things that goes right back to the first conversation you asked me, do we have the data? Where is the data? How do we get it to the right people? And how do we ensure that when they're trying to make decisions about policy and legislation, which, by the way, I am very nervous about. I don't like a lot of policy and legislation because it puts the decisions into the hands of the wrong people, the people without the data. The people with the data are sat here in this room. We all know that industry makes better, more astute business decisions than government. And therefore, we've got to make sure that data gets into the hands of the right people before the wrong legislation and the wrong policy is adopted. And by the way, I'm here to talk about charging, so that was totally off topic. Apologies.
We need to stop there. I think you've been trying to signal to me several times that we need to stop. So the first session was meant to be about what's the current state. I think we've started talking about a lot of the problems and what needs to happen, etc. So I think we're on our way to identifying those. The next session is meant to be around what's the end game. If we think that's 2040 or closer or further away, let's debate that maybe. But that's the sort of the timeline we're looking at, and what is a good situation for all of us here and all the fleet operators, etc. What does that look like then in 2040 from all of these perspectives? I am conscious that we ended up talking a lot about policy and costs, etc., but we haven't really touched upon charging yet. So we do need to maybe suggest that we kick off with that when we come back. But I think we've got a 10-minute break now. Is that okay? Yeah?